Thank you everyone for being here. I realise we're trying to juggle these things with lots of other activities at the moment. So what I'm talking about today is based on an article that Stefan Ramakas and I wrote, and it's been recently published in a special issue of Families, Relationships and Society. That article is not available in open access, but an earlier version is. So I'm going to attempt to share the link so that you have that, should you wish to. I'll put that in the chat later on. So I do have a PowerPoint to share, which I'm sure you'll all be delighted to hear. So can you see the PowerPoint at this point? Yeah? Excellent. Winning at technology. So I'm going to talk through the article, which basically looks at the recent advent of parenting apps into the whole kind of parenting culture, and presents a kind of a different argument to the one that we see in the critical research on this coming from sociology. So just by way of introduction, I'm just going to read you the abstract, and then I'll fill you on some of the background. So in educational research, digital technology has received considerable attention, understandably. And in early childhood studies, this is largely focused on children. But our concern here is with the figure of the parent, and on a specific digital technology, apps designed for parents. While apps can be seen as a digital extension of existing information and advice that has proliferated in the turn to parenting, and exhibits many of the characteristics of the parenting culture, for example, positioning parents as in need of education, drawing predominantly from developmental psychology and neuroscience, the particular affordances of apps draw attention to a more profound shift, we argue, in how we understand what it means to raise children today. Particularly so if we reassert the representational, so the political, pedagogical dimension of the figure of the parent. So just to kind of give some background to where we're coming from. Broadly speaking, we found that when upbringing or raising children is talked about in educational research, it's predominantly dealt with the kind of theoretical frameworks from psychology, neuropsychology and sociology. And when it comes to critical accounts looking at these trends, these are coming predominantly from sociology. And it's only quite recently that philosophy of education has started to look at this and to kind of articulate its own response, because in the past it's tended to be overlooked, especially in pedagogical terms, we would argue, which means that certain aspects of our experience of raising children are left out of the picture. If we're predominantly drawing on kind of registers of psychology and sociology, then that's kind of narrowing the language we have at our disposal to talk about what it means to raise children. So what I'm presenting today, the work we've done on apps, the work that David mentioned before, drawing on film, is in view of developing a specifically pedagogical account of upbringing. So recently, as I said, this has started to gather attention in philosophy of education, I think particularly since these discourses of psychology, the learnification, if you like, have become more prominent, and the parenting culture more generally has become more prominent. So in developing this specifically pedagogical account of raising children, we're drawing predominantly on a continental tradition where the family has been seen as one of the key pedagogical institutions alongside, traditionally at least, the school and the church, and so very much worthy of consideration when we're thinking about the pedagogical institutions in our society. So as I said, the emergence of the parenting account of raising children has renewed interest in this area in philosophy of education as having something both critical and affirmative, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute to say. And so recent examples are the book that came out in 2012 by Stefan Ramekers and Judith Suissa, which developed the kind of more critical account of the parenting culture and the parenting account of raising children from a philosophical perspective. And then more recently, we've tried to do that in a more affirmative vein in the book that uses film. So the one you can see there on the right, Philosophical Presentations of Raising Children. So apologies for this quite wordy slide, but just to give you some more of the theoretical background that we're drawing on when we're trying to develop this pedagogical account of raising children, specifically drawing on that continental tradition, but also in this article we're drawing on the work of Stanley Cavell to do that. So our discussion, and I'm going to read a few extracts from the article at this point. Our discussion is situated against the background of an educational philosophical tradition of understanding raising children as an intergenerational relationship, in which the parent is understood as always situated, quote, between child and world, that is, between their child and some form of communal life, which they inevitably represent. Drawing mainly on Stanley Cavell's conception of initiation in forms of life, we offer a pedagogical account of what is at stake in the introduction of parenting apps for our understanding of raising children today, and in particular for our understanding of the figure of the parent. So this conception of initiation into forms of life we see as valuable in terms of broadening our conception of this intergenerational relationship, which tends to be narrowed down to some sort of kind of interactional dyad in the parenting account of raising children. So this idea comes predominantly from Stanley Cavell in the sense that we're using it. And he uses this broad concept of initiation to capture the way in which parents, in introducing their children to language, also introduce them to a culture, thereby constituting a world. In the context of a discussion of Wittgenstein's vision of language and of what it means to lead a life with language and to lead others, including children, into such a life, Cavell writes, "We initiate them, children, into the relevant forms of life held in language and gathered around the objects and persons of our world." End quote. He also points to the educational / parental responsibility implied in such initiation. If we want our children to lead a life with language, we must make ourselves exemplary, he says, and take responsibility for that assumption of authority. But exemplary here does not mean being the best of examples, for example, showing exemplary behavior, but refers to grown-ups offering or exhibiting themselves as examples of the forms of life they partake in. It thus refers to a particular feature of being a grown-up, our representativeness vis-a-vis the forms of life we initiate children into. So this starts to bring out a much more kind of existential account and draws our attention to the moral complexity of what it means to raise children that we see as kind of missing or left out of the picture in the parenting account of raising children. So this idea of the parent as a pedagogical figure situated between child and world, and therefore representative in some way of the world to the child. It's this very in-betweenness, their exemplarity and responsibility for the assumption of authority, that lends the parent, we argue, an inevitable political feature. Not political in the sense of an adherence to a particular political position or advocating for a particular political issue, but because of the parent's representativeness, i.e. their exemplarity and responsibility, encapsulated in the observation that parents are generally the first to speak to their children. So this responsibility that comes with this kind of in-betweenness of the parent, we try to articulate as political, but also drawing on a sense of community. So again, this intergenerational relationship is not just about a kind of one-on-one parent-child relationship, but is about the parent as representative of a wider culture, of a generation. So in terms of this idea of the initiation into language, not just being about teaching them to speak as such, but initiating them into a form of life, we write, what we do and say is always open to partial agreement, partial dissent, contestation, disruption, and so on. In this sense, the community we participate in is continuously in the making, both by grown-ups and the children they initiate into it, on a daily basis, in the very sayings and doings of those giving expression to it. So this is kind of the theoretical background with which we articulate this idea of the parent as a representative political figure. And the relevance of this hopefully will become clear later on. So in terms of what we're contrasting this with, or what we're trying to articulate as missing, we can see in the examples of the parenting culture. So we've seen over the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years, a huge proliferation in manuals, so books for parents. Apologies, my neighbours are having their house rebuilt, apparently, if you can hear a lot of noise outside. Parenting classes, TV series such as Super Nanny, and websites aimed at parents. So these are commonplace. I'm sure you'll be familiar with them. And these tend to echo wider policy initiatives focused on families and parents. So the need for early intervention, for example, and the need for parents to be engaged in their children's learning. But also they're characteristic of wider trends in late neoliberalism of responsibilisation, so taking increasing responsibility on an individual level for our own learning and development, and what Nicholas Rose refers to as the generosity of expertise. So expertise no longer being restricted to the domain of the experts, but being made available to the wider public in view of this responsibilisation. So we can see some examples there. So Mumsnet is a very high profile one. Super Nanny, as I've already mentioned, which started as a TV series. There are accompanying books, and now also, as we'll go on to see, apps as well. And things like the Contented Little Baby book, which provide a whole kind of schema for caring for your baby right from the start, a whole program of how to instill particular routines and a particular style of parenting, if you like, from a very early age. And we can also see a general theme emerging in terms of the kind of the scientific credentials given to these various parenting styles and so on. So you can see from the examples of books there, very much the influence of psychology, but also increasingly neuroscience in shaping this discourse of parenting. So scientific parenting, smart parenting, smarter kids. So you can also already see the kind of causality being implied there as well, brain-based parenting, and so on. So these are just a small sample, but very much indicative of some wider trends that have been evident in the parenting culture for some time. So, as I said, the majority of the critical analysis that's been done on this parenting culture, as it's referred to, has predominantly come from sociology, who identify this kind of instrumentalisation and professionalisation of raising children as parenting, very much focusing on what we do and that having the maximal learning outcomes for our children. The influence of psychology, referred to as psychologization and neuropsychologization. So the language of psychology kind of becoming the default register in which we understand ourselves and why we do what we do with our children. And as I mentioned, this trend towards responsibilization comes along with accounts of late neoliberal governmentality. So generally speaking then, what we find in these critical accounts is the sense in which parents are being politicized, used as or targeted in view of particular political ends or addressed as being part of a particular social problem, and therefore with specific groups targeted by particular parenting interventions, which absolutely makes sense, and we don't disagree with that analysis. And we could also say that this extends to the way in which we might critically analyse the digitisation of parenting. So when we see these kind of trends, discourses and so on, taken from the parenting literature, the TV shows, into the domain of digital apps, we can argue that the same processes are going on. The kind of datafication, the algorithmicization can very much be seen in terms of instrumentalisation and so on, and a general politicisation of particular groups. So in that sense, we could see parenting apps as merely an extension of the current parenting culture, and so subject it to the same critique. Before I move on to how we offer a different account than we find in the sociological literature, I just want to give you a sense of what these parenting apps actually do, for those of you who've not used them. So I'll show you a few examples, and generally on a basic level they can give you advice on feeding, exercise, nutrition, advice on dealing with everyday parenting challenges like getting the bedtime routine right, getting the bath time routine right, weaning, all of these things. Helpful additions like a feed timer, so you know how long you've been feeding for. And then particular developmental tasks and activities to do with your child that are kind of age appropriate and designed to be stimulating and good for their learning at that particular age. And then it's also a way of recording information. So these apps start from early pregnancy, so you can measure the number of kicks you've felt in a particular day, or later on the number of feeds you've given, when they last had a bath, their temperature, their weight, and so on and so on. So all of these things, you can store this information in one of these apps. So let me see if I can share something else, just so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is one example. This is Baby Manager. Can you see that? Yeah, cool. Right, so this is Baby Manager, which does a lot of the things that I've just mentioned. You can store information relating to feeding, sleeping, changing, growth, and so on. You can see this is just on the App Store, so these are very easy to get hold of. Quite often they're free to download. There's various ways in which you can track activities and so on, and by entering this data, you'll see that the app will develop various charts and graphs for you, and send you reminders and so on. So it's a kind of a two-way thing, in which you can store information for yourself, but also be sent information. This is another example, and it's part of a bigger organisation called Vroom, which is very much about developmental activities. You can see it's part of the Bezos Family Foundation, so it has a lot of kind of investment behind it. And you can see very clearly in this example the influence of the kind of the neuroscientific knowledge coming through. So parents being situated in this case as brain builders. That is kind of the fundamental role of the parent in the early years, is to build their brain, basically, in this example. And then the third example I'm going to show you is Parenting Quiz or Parenting Challenge, which is an app that you can use to essentially test your knowledge and ability as a parent by taking a daily quiz. Basically, sending you a quiz every day, which tests your knowledge, and then see if you get the answers wrong, it will tell you the right answer and how you should be doing it. So these are just three examples amongst a very crowded marketplace of parenting apps. Sorry, right. Okay, so in addition to all of this kind of storing of information and then sending advice, they also work in a similar way to social media. So you can share with your partner, family members, other parents. So kind of making what you're doing visible to other people. So these were only a few examples, but from what we've seen in our wider analysis, we can see that the apps share at least two aspects with what we're calling analog sources, so the books, the TV shows, and so on. We can see the scientisation that we also see in the books and the TV shows, very much focused on the reliability, the scientific credentials, the verification, tried and tested kind of knowledge coming from these kind of from psychology, neuroscience, and so on. And we can also see the professionalisation that we see in the parenting culture more generally, this focus on learning optimization, as we saw in the kind of the brain builder focus of the Zoom app. So in that sense, apps can be seen to intensify what the sociological critique sees as the politicisation of parenting. And this is supported as well by the idea that these apps, by the way that they work, gather ever more detailed data on individuals, groups, and subcategories according to any number of identity markers. So tracking the usage of particular apps according to gender, age, sexuality, ethnicity, and so on, because of the kinds of information you have to put into the app in order for it to provide information back to you. So whereas the ones we've just looked at are predominantly developed by private app developers or private or philanthropic organisations, these apps have also been developed by organisations like the NHS because they are a very more reliable way of accessing what we call hard to reach or at-risk groups in society, whereas people may not feel willing or able to access services physically. Most people have a smartphone, so using an app to provide public health advice and information is something that started to happen, certainly in the UK anyway. The Easy Peasy app is one example that's targeted at the early years. Teachers are trained in how to use it so they can promote it in turn to parents. And it sends activities and tips to parents to help improve toddlers' language, in particular, language and communication skills, as part of the kind of policy drive to narrow that gap that seem to exist between groups in society in terms of how much language they've been exposed to before they start school. So the language of that app speaks about encouraging and enabling parents to provide, quote, a vibrant home learning environment. And as I say, it's partly there to attempt to close that attainment gap. So there's an explicit link there, if we're looking back to this critique of the politicisation of parenting, an explicit link there between parental engagement and social mobility. So that critique does seem to apply when we look at these parenting apps. But our perspective is slightly different, drawing on the account of the parent as a political, pedagogical figure that I went through at the beginning. Because what we've identified in the apps is that there are further aspects that are distinctive to apps that mean we cannot just, or it doesn't necessarily make sense from a pedagogical perspective anyway, to just apply the same critique as has been applied to the books and the TV shows and so on that already exist in the parenting culture. So if we see these apps through the lens of the parent as a political, representative, pedagogical figure, our argument is that apps actually affect a depoliticisation of the parent. So in view of not necessarily adding a further layer of critique as such in political terms, but rather focusing on what we do when we raise children, by focusing on depoliticisation, we start to draw attention to what is left out of the picture in the parenting account of raising children. So the three aspects that we identify then as being distinctive to apps that we don't necessarily see in books and so on are personalisation, visualisation, and community. So as we saw in those examples then, these apps work in a similar way to social media. You add personal information such as your date of birth and so on, media, so photos of your child reaching a particular milestone. And then one of the selling points of these apps is that the information you receive is personalised. It's specific to you, your interests, and the particular age of your child. So this personalised information is realised both through the static data that you put in, so the basic information that you have to put in when you subscribe to an app, and the dynamic data, so what you're inputting on a daily basis, what it's measuring, in terms of the explicit data you're putting in, but also what the app is recording in terms of how you're using it. And so you're generating a kind of a data-based relationship between yourself as a parent and an app, and the app. And so this personalisation effectively constitutes a kind of active feedback loop, which we argue is different than in if you're taking advice and information from, say, a book or a TV show and so on. So we suggest the introduction of apps arguably marks a shift from generalised advice offered by books and websites, or from personal advice in a face-to-face meeting with an expert, such as a health visitor or something, to the possibility of personalised content based on the individual parents and child's inputted data. So whereas a book, for example, will give you a general picture of what perhaps you ought to do that you then need to apply to yourself, an app only works through the personalisation enabled in its design. So you have to put something of your own personal information in there in order for it to be able to give personalised information back to you. So the second aspect that is distinctive, we would argue, is this visualisation. Now obviously TV shows and books are very much visual media, but it relates back to personalisation in the sense that what is being visualised is specifically based on and generated by the personalised information generated and the data that you're inputting into the app. So as we saw in the examples, based on the kind of information you've given about feeds or sleeping or whatever it might be, the app will generate timelines of these events, so reaching milestones and so on, images, graphs and things, and charts to show essentially your performance. So it's kind of curating what you've been doing and the activities and so on, day-to-day activities, into these kind of more formalized timelines, graphs, charts and so on. So it's those forms of visualization based on your own data that we see as distinctive in the apps. Deborah Lupton, who's a sociologist based in Australia, has looked at apps in the context of health monitoring. And what she's found is that this visual image or data, so the kind of the graphs and charts about what we've been doing that we see in these apps, are often privileged as more objective than the signs offered by the real fleshly body and patients' own accounts of their bodies. So there's a sense then that what the app generates based on the data that's been inputted by you on the basis of what you've been doing with your child will be seen as a more authoritative version of events than your own kind of perceptions or feelings or instincts. So we say the data visualizations in the apps as feedback on one's own activities might, in conjunction with the language of reliability and verification that we see, so all of the apps that we've looked at very much promote the fact that they are reliable, scientifically verified, tried and tested, and so on. These visualizations might appear a more objective form of self-knowledge than one's own decisions about how to best interact or play with or feed one's child. So we've looked at personalisation and visualisation. The third aspect that we look at is community, going back to this idea of the parent as a political representative figure and therefore representative of a community in the sense of a wider culture. Now, the language of community is very prominent in these apps, as I think it is in many apps, not just in the domain of parenting. So sharing information is expressed in terms of belonging to a community of users. The community element of the apps appeals to a concern with learning and identifies parents as a group with specific needs and interests. So they promote themselves as constituting a particular kind of community, but in contrast to the sense of community that we articulated earlier as one where there is kind of continual contestation, it's always in the making. This particular kind of community that is generated in an app is one in which the user makes herself visible by way of this personalized, curated version of herself as a parent, and is constituted on the basis of shared beliefs, opinions, and aspirations. So that is their like-mindedness. And so the notion of community that we see in these apps suggests the possibility of removing disagreement, uncertainty, ambiguity, and internal conflict, in contrast to that more political conception that we saw earlier on. So in terms of this more political conception of community then that we see as being kind of left out of the picture in this conception that we find in the apps. Once you're kind of within the domain of the app, the primary reference point for what you say and do becomes the in-app science and what it makes available, which is enabled by the mechanisms of personalization and visualization, and not primarily or necessarily the community of which we make ourselves representative on a daily basis. So in an app, we have a very narrow source of expertise, provided in a kind of a non-contestable space because of this kind of feedback loop that's constituted between the information you're asked for and the categories according to which that is provided back to you. In an app, you have the action of this algorithmic agency on the knowledge and advice that we receive and how we receive it. And you're interacting with a pre-existing body of knowledge that's made available by the data that you input. So again, this kind of narrow source of knowledge and information that is available to you in this feedback loop within the app. So this is why we move from this critique of politicization that we find in sociology towards the critique of depoliticisation that we think is illustrated by the apps and perhaps brought into sharper relief by the apps, but arguably has been present in the parenting culture more generally for some time. So we say the positioning of the parent in the digitisation of parenting overlooks or seeks to overcome the very real experience of the child's disruption of our sense of how things should be. By bracketing out community, as always in the making, through contestation, disruption, refinding agreement in and against a common world, such disruption becomes an individual learning issue for which apps offer a solution. So in terms of the possibility, the inevitability of disruption, we suggest we're witnessing a shift that qualitatively alters the nature of disruption, or perhaps neutralises it. We're witnessing a shift from a political level, so the level of which we speak when seeing the parent as a figure of pedagogical representation, to the level of digital information that can be dealt with, calculated, measured and manipulated, in which the messy, physical, flesh and blood interactions with one another, these real-life confrontations, are deemed problematic rather than political or pedagogical, and neatened into algorithmicized, psychologized translations of our actions and interactions. So, this is the kind of the disclaimer bit where I go, well, we don't have any firm conclusions. This is part of an ongoing project. But some of the implications that we draw from this are questions about where we situate parental responsibility in this context, in this kind of triad between the parent, the child, and the app, and how to today to conceptualize that. To whom or what is that responsibility assigned when we enter an app-based pro-parenting community, which is how one of the apps describes the kind of community that it's constituting. This notion of responsibility, in the specific sense that we invoke, always refers back to something shared or public or communal. And it's not clear what this is in an app. It seems to change that dynamic. And because an app delimits the words we use and the possibility of being confronted by other articulations, it also seems to affect our understanding of our responsibility for exemplarity and representativeness. So this goes back to this idea of the depoliticisation, this dispositioning of the parent, as we put it, as that representative pedagogical figure. So part of the wider claim that we make then is about this dispositioning of the parent in this context of this kind of closed feedback loop where a particular body of knowledge provides the reference point for how to raise children. So without reference to or debate on cultural public norms and values, apps enable parents to navigate a permanently shifting distance between who they are, who they and their children are now, based on the data entered, and who they and their children can become through the visualization of the next milestone to be achieved, the next strategy to implement. What makes a parent the person she is bracketed out of the picture. What makes these suggested activities valuable is not in question. So this emphasis on personalisation in the parenting apps discussed is not, it seems, a reference to persons as persons. The affordances of personalisation go hand in hand rather with a depersonalising effect. Parents here are, as the apps indicate, like-minded. Making the parent visible in this way is paradoxically constitutive of her disappearance as a specifically pedagogical figure. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
With Richard. Richard, you asked the first question. Do you want to ask that question now? You should be able to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. I think it was going, probably going back a little bit, and we probably answer his agreement here. But I wondered what your view was on the view in terms of this advice by statistical norms, and particularly the ways in which apps use the data and the big data to start to be able to pull together global norms in relation to the upbringing of children. So my guess is, I don't know the apps particularly, they weren't around when Evie was around as a small baby, but that they pull together statistical data from users and then set those as the norms in terms of how others should behave, but presumably that's on a global scale rather than a local scale.
Yes, although the data would also be geographical as well. So that would also be indicative. So when I was talking about the Easy Peasy app, one of the specific things that they want to measure or gather data on with the use of the Easy Peasy app is specifically which are those, where are the parents who are or who are not using this app and engaging with their child's learning in that way. So it's as much, when it comes to geographical location, I think it's as much about who's not using the apps, particularly when the apps are developed by public services, as opposed to who is using them. But then where the apps are being developed by private organisations, that data is absolutely being used to generate new features for the apps and generate, it internally will generate new norms, I guess, in terms of what information and advice is given to the users.
Thank you. Ruth, I can see you've indicated that your hand is raised. Do you want to ask a question there, Ruth?
Yes. Hi, thanks. I found that really interesting, Naomi, thank you. My question is about Cavell, initiation. So initiation, I'm going to have a little bit of a digression here. So the question I'm asking, perhaps to everyone, is parenting a practice in the sense, in the McIntyre sense of initiation into practices? So some time ago in the journal, in Job, there was a big discussion went on. I think some of you might remember it. Joe Dunn was involved and Chris Higgins and so forth. Is teaching a practice? And some of us thought, well, teaching is maybe a set of practices. So that aspect of what you had to say about Cavell and initiation interested me very much. So my question is parenting a practice in that sense? Do people think? Do you think, Naomi?
I would say that in the way that it becomes kind of professionalized and particular parenting styles are articulated and particular kind of strategies to deal with X are articulated by experts, then in that sense it is presented as a practice in which one could become better or worse at, or more competent or less competent at. But I think the sense of initiation that we take from Cavell is not seeing parenting as a practice, but seeing it as initiation into a set of practices that are specific to your culture and so on.
So it's existential.
Yes, yeah. So I wouldn't see it in the kind of McIntyre sense that you mentioned there.
Thanks. Yeah.
Naomi, can I come in with a question? Oh, I've got one from Sean here. Sean, do you want to ask that question? You're muted at the moment. You just muted yourself again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, no, my question is that I see a certain irony in all this, in that the parents who might benefit, insofar as there is a real benefit from using these apps, could well be the ones that are least likely to use them, in the sense of, you know, if the purported benefit of the apps is to level the playing pitch to a certain extent, my feeling is that the parents who are most likely to use these apps are those that are on the higher end of the pitch, and the ones on the lower end who most need leveling probably aren't even aware of them. Just an observation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think to a certain extent that's why perhaps public services have started to use them, because actually smartphones are seen to be a way to target those particular groups. But obviously those kind of apps which are used to specifically make targeted interventions, if you like, exist in a kind of different part of the marketplace than ones that are associated with, say, particular parenting styles. So ones that, you know, the Super Nanny app, for example, where by downloading that you've kind of already bought into a particular way of, you know, raising your children, particular disciplinary practices and so on, such as the naughty step or whatever it is. So yes, I do. I think that's right, and I think it's a criticism that's made of the general discourse of closing the gap. That with this whole marketplace of ways of kind of optimizing learning and investing in your children's learning, those, as you say, the kind of who already are fairly well advantaged in that sense, will only increase their advantage. So it's, you know, closing the gap is a slightly problematic way of putting it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Lindsay to ask a question now.
Yeah, I posted it up in the chat as well, but I'm probably less articulate with my fingers than I am with my head. Yeah, I'm really interested, as not a parent myself, I'm really interested to see, to hear your opinions on whether these kinds of developments are considered like a big kind of leap forward, something that's kind of like a transformative kind of interruption of technology, or whether they're considered more of, part of a more gradual development away from that kind of, I guess, away from the kind of the mother-in-law teaching you how to do something, or something, into kind of less, more autonomous choices about who you get your advice from, in terms of things like NCT groups, peer groups, friends, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think in a sense they are symptomatic of that, as you say, that break from there being this kind of passing on of wisdom from your mother or your grandmother or whatever. And I think it not just in raising children, but in many spheres of our lives now, we don't have that, and we have to find the information from somewhere else. And also I think we no longer assume that the way our parents did things was necessarily the right way, and we now have this kind of literal marketplace of ideas from where we can choose, as you say, autonomously how we want to do it. So in the sense of it being a major kind of interruption, I think potentially it is, particularly in that when we're thinking about parents, but I think it's on a par with the general more radical interruption that we perceive from digital technology more generally. For example, the way it comes into classrooms and displaces the pedagogical authority of the teacher in making those judgments about, what a child should be doing. When we implement a reading program, for example, in the classroom that does that assessment for you. So I think it's in some ways on a par with that, but going back to what Ruth was saying, it's not a practice in the same way as being a teacher is. And so there's perhaps something more radical there in the parenting culture more generally, in terms of that kind of displacement of parental authority. I think parents are generally seen as kind of a risk factor in children's lives in general, and these are kind of a way to kind of mitigate that. If we give them as many tools as possible, they're less likely to make a complete hash of it. So yeah, I think there are kind of wider cultural things going on whereby we don't have, or don't necessarily inherit anymore, a kind of standard way of doing things. But I also think these kind of apps, part of the argument we're making is that these apps reduce the need to have that conversation publicly and culturally about what that might look like, because these bodies of knowledge are just made available to us and very quickly become a kind of default way of talking about how to do it right.
Thank you. Ruth, I see your hand is, I don't know whether it's still up or whether you've put it up again, whether you wanted to come in on that.
Sorry, no, it's still up. I should take it down.
Thank you. Then I'm going to ask Victoria. Victoria's got a question.
Oh yeah, sorry. I think the question's there really, but I was just found it. Thank you, firstly, Naomi. I found that really interesting, and I was thinking what your position on this really is in the current times that we find ourselves in. With the changes in social distancing, particularly whether they create a community and a space for parents to come together. And I was wondering really whether you see a different type of value going forward post COVID-19.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm a fan of a COVID-19 hot take. So I think we've all developed a different relationship to digital technology more generally in the last month. In its value in terms of being able to be in touch with people and continue to do our jobs, for our children to remain in touch with some semblance of normality has been massively important. But I think it also, how we take that value forward after this is a matter for kind of public discussion. It goes back to this idea that we need to kind of have a conversation about what the internet even is and what it ought to be doing and not doing in our society, which I don't think is a conversation we've really had as a society. We've just kind of got the internet and it has various affordances and so on, but it is also very much kind of capitalized in various ways. So the ways in which those affordances are being capitalized on, in terms of, look, you can do all of your teaching online, So therefore, why wouldn't you? And the various kind of new technologies that are being invested in now, because they're the only way that we can carry on, is obviously really good, and we do need to carry on. But I think there is a bigger question, again, a public question that, you know, will be very difficult to find agreement on, about the role that these technologies have in our lives. And it's a big part of the conversation about parenting as well. You know, what's the right amount of technology? What's the right amount of screen time? And the truth is, we don't know. And it was quite funny, in the first couple of weeks of lockdown, a parenting expert who'd written quite a lot about screen time, her kind of famous advice that a lot of parents took seriously was no screen time for the under twos. No, it's too dangerous. Within 2 weeks of lockdown, she's like, no, it's an emotional lifeline. Then just give them all the screen. So, you know, neither of those positions is right or wrong. We just don't know. But I think it's one of those things that, as parents, as grown-ups, or whatever, we need to have a conversation about, in terms of the internet as a kind of a public utility. I don't even know if that answered your question, but that was my thinking off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. I had a question, and you mentioned it again in your response to the last question. You talked about the use of these various technologies in the classroom, neurotechnologies, visualizing technologies. And I was fascinated by your slide on visualization, where you say that the visualization that is produced purports to tell you more about your relationship with the child than you know yourself. And that just resonates with some observations I've made about various kind of biofeedback technologies, promises that are made about brain imaging technologies. So I wondered either if you'd had thoughts about how that was a more sort of extensive observation, or whether you just wanted to unpack that you know, more of that slide.
Yeah, so the visualization aspect is something that I'm trying to work on in more detail, because I do think that it's such a prominent part of the way in which these technologies are designed, because it's not just their functionality that makes people take them up, it's their aesthetics as well. And I think that's a huge part of how and why we use them. But yeah, that sense in which this somehow a graph is a more valuable or authoritative account of myself and my relationship with my child than the fact that I'm really, really tired and I don't know what to do, is really interesting. And yeah, it's something I'm still looking at, so I don't know that I have any particular insight to offer at this point. But I do think, so one of the brain imaging you mentioned, that's one of the kind of the most cited examples of the power of this neuro parenting, or the brain discourse in early years. The kind of the magic first 1,000 days, basically, if you don't get all the right synapses sorted in that time, then you've messed it up. But that comparative image that was used in healthcare training for years, about, you know, the well looked after child and the disadvantaged child, that was, you know, a completely kind of false comparison, but had huge power and kind of carried an entire discourse on the basis of that one image. So yes, the short answer is I'm still looking into it, but it's definitely a very distinctive part of these digital technologies that you need a different form of analysis than if we're analysing the imagery of a book or a TV show, I think.
Right, thank you very much. Sunny, I noticed you've just turned your camera on. Is that because you had a question? Please do, come in. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry. Thanks, Naomi. It was really nice.
Nice.
I've got two questions. One is quite simple, and the other one is quite silly. But let me go ahead. So the first question is about your talk on this sociological critique, and you mentioned about this analog sources. Yeah, and you talked about scientisation, right? Yeah. Scientisation and the professionalization. That I understand. I think I understood what you meant by a scientisation and professionalization, but I just couldn't follow further that you said like that's kind of a politicization of parenting. that link I couldn't quite match. Maybe that's just like you can explain me. Yeah, but the second question is the silly one. So when you talked about the language of the apps with this parenting, I was with the personalization, visualization, and the community. I immediately thought about another type of apps about like a physical training. It's a fitness training, and it shows like if I especially personalization and the visualization, and you mentioned about aesthetic as well. So I'm also using this app, fitness app, and it shows this is your current body. I'm not really proud of myself, but this is the ideal one. Yeah. So, I mean, this is the way, but you can also use the apps for your fitness condition. And it also like really well applying personalization and the visualization and the community. And I kind of come up with this idea, how much would you find the problem with these parenting apps you identified is near the like a fitness app compared to like a teaching apps most the teachers might use. So I'm talking about the nearness between parenting app and the fitness health app opposed to this teachers app. I mean, I want to talk about this, like some kind of imply this private matters that is something attached to this parenting, like related to like the way you would understand your body compared to teaching apps that is kind of supposed to be used by like teachers as an expertise.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the first question about the sociological critique. So broadly speaking, the sociological critique is coming from, I guess, sociology in general, rather than sociology of education, and perhaps that's why there's a more political focus. But generally, the focus on the parenting culture has identified, you know, parents being targeted as a particular problem for social policy or intervening in parenting in a particular way to achieve wider kind of social policy or educational policy ends. So it's in that sense that they tend to, in general terms, talk about the politicization of parenting. So parents being a particular focus of policy making. So that's where that politicization idea comes from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yes.
So
thank you.
Yeah, so therefore we contrast our more pedagogical perspective with that critique and try to articulate the kind of the depoliticizing, so removing that kind of specific representativeness of the parent through these apps. But the second question wasn't silly at all, actually. I think it really relates back to what David was saying. So that image of this is what you look like now was, I think, a really good example of this sense of, well, the app potentially being more authoritative a sense of what you look like than your own kind of...
Exactly.
Because, you know, I know you, and you don't look like that picture on the app. But that becomes kind of the benchmark against which you assess your progress in terms of fitness and so on.
Yeah.
Which I find really interesting because it's somehow your own judgment about how you feel and how you look and so on is kind of what's the word, abdicated to a kind of supposedly higher authority because the app's based in science, right? So yeah, and so in that sense there is a very similar logic to parenting apps, teaching apps, fitness apps, maybe even dating apps, friendship apps. I mean, there are certain affordances that they all have. So, which is why we say that the parenting apps work in a similar way to social media. You can share what you're doing, you can connect with other people, it's part of a community, you see your progress, your performance. And the first app that I was talking about is called Baby Manager. You know, it could be like Office Manager or Football Manager, I don't know. It's just, you know, there's a very kind of generic aspect to it, which I suppose kind of goes back to Ruth's question about, is it a practice? And this instrumentalisation, I suppose, makes it into a practice that is akin to, I don't know, teaching or exercising or any other kind of practical thing that we do, that we want to get better at, that there are, scientific theories about how we can optimize our performance and so on. So that, I guess, is another aspect of the kind of removal of the person of the parent, because it doesn't actually matter. I mean, it could be anyone using a parenting app to raise a child. There is nothing that says only the parent can use it. So there's a kind of flattening out of all of these things by the similarity in how these apps work, I suppose.
Did you want to come back to that, Sunil, quickly?
Oh, yeah, I mean, thanks so much, Naomi. Thanks so much for the excellent explanation. But I mean, the way I try to make sense of this, your talk is this, like, you mentioned this parenting as parents as a representative pedagogical figure, right? And I just wondered how we can differentiate like a teacher's figure as a representative pedagogical figure. I mean, maybe you can elaborate further about representative pedagogical, what you meant by that. But I mean, this is the point. So my example of this body apps, like fitness app, it's something about your personal assessment of your own body, right? Mm. So that I try to touch upon this personal assessment or personal aspects of parenting that is a kind of like evaporated in this personalized contents. So that's the way that I try to distinguish between parents as the representative pedagogical figure opposed to teachers as a pedagogical representative figure. So I'm just trying to make sense of this, the personalized aspects of parenting, just like your own perspectives on your body that is negated in these body apps or parenting apps. Does it make sense? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and so I suppose it comes down to the specifics of the parent as a pedagogical figure, but one that is different in kind from the teacher.
Yeah.
But I would say,
and I wondered that if you imply some kind of like a personal assessment of your action as a parent, that is something different from this professional practice for the teachers to do, and in the name of a pedagogical representative figure.
Yeah. So, but I suppose that what the predominantly, ideally, I suppose what the teacher is representative of is first and foremost the subject. There's quite a kind of a specific focus to that. It doesn't have the kind of the breadth and the protocols of. There is a lack of protocols, I suppose, that go with being a parent. So yes, both pedagogical figures, but I would say different. And the danger that we have is that the parent is seen increasingly like a teacher in the sense that they should have protocols, strategies, and so on.
Thanks. I'm going to bring in, I've got two questions. I've got Lindsay and Ruth. Lindsay's explicitly as a follow-up from part of that. So I'm going to bring Lindsay in first.
Cool. So this is getting really complicated in my mind. So thinking about values and this question of the values and the data being used perhaps to converge into what values the users of these apps kind of have being used to, I guess, kind of create the values that then inform the apps, this kind of like artificial intelligence kind of thing. Is that kind of what's happening, or is there some sort of more explicit diversification in these apps in terms of the values that underlie them? I mean, I'm thinking when you made the analogy with dating apps. So I have some friends who use dating apps. I have a friend who uses dating apps. And so, you know, that apparently there's been kind of this diversification in terms of, and the values that these different apps are kind of adhering to is both implicit in their design and also sometimes now made explicit in when you sign up for an account. You sign up for, you know, this is how I'm going to behave, this kind of ethic, or this kind of this is my purpose in using this app, you know. So I wondered if that if that diversification is also kind of playing out in these parenting apps as well, or is it, yeah?
Yeah, so I would say probably both things are going on. So in the sense that, so this notion of community that we find being promoted in a lot of the apps kind of invites, I guess, a certain set of values, even though they're not necessarily explicit in terms of values, but, you know, is this what you want for your child? And the very fact that you're looking for an app, I suppose it either indicates a particular problem or a particular kind of motivation to invest in that kind of activity. But this sense of community suggests that, yes, this is a group of people with shared values, with similar aims and goals and so on. So in that sense, there is a kind of a general sharing of values. The other thing that we find when we're looking at the language of the apps is that they try to kind of say these are suitable for anyone. It doesn't matter your background, your, you know, culture, religion, anything like that, because it's, at the end of the day, we're taking it down to basic science. This works, so therefore it doesn't matter about any of that. But on the other hand, there are specific apps for specific parenting styles, for example. So, and maybe for particular user groups, so parents of children with special educational needs, for example. So, but I don't know if that's a kind of diversification of values or just market diversification in terms of locating where there's a need. So yeah, I think it depends on where the app's coming from and what the aims of the app are in terms of how much that's implicit or explicit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It's interesting thinking about how that design and the way that the development is playing out is, I guess, kind of a product of, I mean, the purpose in these people creating these apps is never going to be completely altruistic and benevolent, isn't it? So it's thinking about, I guess I'm thinking about what are the ulterior motives of the app creators, and what are all those different motives? That's a different set of stuff to what produces schools. Yeah,
and I suppose there's two other aspects as well. The kind of the science that's drawn upon as the kind of authoritative body of knowledge that tells us how we ought to be raising children, or what are the activities that we should do at each particular age for optimal development. They're not value free after all, so that's very much implicit in what's going on in the app, and parents again are not in a position to be able to assess the science on its own terms. So it's very much only in terms of the values of, you know, is this what you want for your child, that a parent can kind of make that assessment as to whether to use an app or not, I would say, in general terms. But I think the apps are coming from different places. So some apps are developed by app developers. They can see a gap in the market and they've decided to develop an app for parents, and they've developed all sorts of other apps. But then there are other so kind of learning organizations, pedagogical organizations, who are specifically concerned with child development and so on, who have then diversified what they do into an app. And then there are the kind of the public services like the NHS who are developing apps because of particular needs for particular interventions and so on. So yeah, there's a kind of, there'll be overlapping priorities there, but obviously different motivations in all of those cases.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to bring Ruth in now.
Okay, I've unmuted. So what do you think of the idea that there are fashions in the instrumentalisation of parenting? Example, when I was a young parent, a parent of young children rather, I felt I had to strongly resist the notion of what was called the schizophrenic mother. you would be responsible, the mother would be responsible for mental illness, which would occur in children much later on, and so on. And it occurs to me that it would be very interesting to search the historical literature to see how this instrumentalisation is conceived. So over to you.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that this is not new in the sense that advice for parents has never been in short supply. I think it's fair to say, for a few hundred years, whether that was coming from your mother, your mother-in-law, from the kind of the one handbook that may have existed, or from this now plethora of different advice sources of advice that we can choose from. But so yeah, the historical account of this is not something that I'm working on, but I think our relationship to that expertise is perhaps different, and the way in which we access that expertise as well, and also who we see the child as being has massively changed over that time as well. I think, as you say, mothers in particular have been seen to be problematic. I think throughout time they've always been in need of some sort of information and advice and expertise as to how they really ought to be doing it. But I think now that active investment in finding out how I ought to be doing it is perhaps grown in the last 10 to 20 years, as in all aspects of our lives we've been asked to kind of invest more in kind of learning skills in all aspects of our lives, if that makes sense.
Yes, thanks. Yeah.